The following is a conversation with the artist Dorje de Burgh. He is a photographer, like his mother before him. The conversation centers around a photograph Dorje's mother Sherrie took of herself standing before a mirror naked. The photograph acts as a foil to discuss the nature of image making and the ethics in terms of the private and public personas that inhabit photographs. I hope you enjoy. So, thank you, Dorje, for doing this.
Thank you for having me. A pleasure. My goodness.
The first part of this really is to what I've found, and I've only done one of these so far, is that you end up describing things because it's an audio recording. There's no visuals. We're referring to an image that you submitted and a bit of text also. So I might read out the text first, and maybe you can describe the image actually after this, and then that gives a sense to the listener what this image is, and then we can discuss it a little bit, you know. So I'm going to just read this out. This is the bit of the blurb that you sent to me. So, I see her gasping to breathe. I see her screaming that she does not want to be loved so much because she spent her childhood afraid to sleep in case she died and left her brothers alone with their father. I see myself on my knees screaming that I am not her father, that I am not Hube or Hube?
Hubie.
Hubie. That I'm not a man and I don't have any power over her. I see her climbing the front steps, black coat and red beret. I wish I could see before this. A lifetime is not a woman stubbornly climbing 15 stone steps with immense and almost indescribable difficulty and the help of two men who are deeply in love with her. She collapses as we enter the doorway. She smiles. I see her alone. I cannot see her really laugh. I know I used to make her really laugh. I see her bald and balding. I clear the hair from her shoulders so it doesn't itch, even though I know she doesn't really feel anything. So maybe start by describing the photograph that you submitted.
The photograph is a self-portrait made by my mum, by Sherrie, who's also the woman described in that passage of text. She's taken a picture of herself in a mirror. And I don't think she's actually pregnant in the picture, but somehow in the course of making the work around her, I think the timeline is wrong, but at some point in the process of making the work, I kind of decided, in the lovely way we can of photographs, to impose a narrative that it was her photographing herself at the very beginning of the pregnancy. It's also to do with the fact that she's obviously dead. She died, which is what I was talking about in that text around a piece of work I was making and writing at the time. And the work was a duet, and that picture kind of served as a duet between her work and my own. And that picture, I suppose, served a little bit as somehow like the imbricated point where perhaps the two of us were in the same picture before I started making images myself, if that makes sense. Yeah. So yeah, I kind of decided that that's what it represented, and I never had any way of finding out if I was right or wrong, but it kind of became the became became the lore around the image for myself.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like I do this a lot as well when when I'm teaching art writing and art criticism. There's a kind of structure I put forward. It's a really basic structure that you describe, you analyze, and then you critique at the end. Now you can juggle those, but in the beginning, it's really good to describe because in a way, description is kind of you have analysis in it, in description, and you have critique in it, just in terms of the metaphors you use and etc. So when I'm looking at this photograph, when you first sent it to me, without any of the knowledge around it, any of the backstory, and I knew some of your work was based around this event, um, so I had that there. I had that baggage there. I have my own baggage as well, in that my own mother died when I was 12 or 13. Um, so so I have those associations with the image. I also have associations with my own wife taking photographs of herself in the mirror as her bump got bigger. So we all have these associations. Like in terms of my description of it, is it shows Sherrie um, in her room, perhaps, taking an image of herself naked in front of the wardrobe mirror. And it's a kind of elliptical shaped mirror. And so, in a weird way, it kind of crops out the rest of the room. So it kind of brings across this kind of fantasy of what's outside the room. The colors of it are they remind me of this painting by, oh, what was it? Delacroix. It's called The Death of Sardanapalus. And it's this kind of image. I think it could be based around some kind of mythology in Morocco. Um, but the colors in that painting itself, and there also is a naked woman in it, but it's a weird one in the sense that there's some kind of king, and he's sitting on a bed, and he's kind of disinterested while everything around him is in chaos. So people are being stabbed, being raped, etc. But it's one of those kind of Delacroix paintings that is kind of an allegory. But the colors in this remind me of that because I suppose Sherrie's headscarf, the color of the wardrobe, it has this kind of rich, kind of rusty color in it. But there's also the thing that it feels private. You know, it feels so. Sherrie seems kind of confident holding this camera. And I'm always wondered about this when just, talking about photographers. I've seen this sometimes where a photographer will take an image of themselves looking in a mirror, holding the camera in front of them. So the camera is between them and the mirror. And it's kind of like, what do you think of that when you look at this image? As formally, like, do you like it as an image itself?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, part of, I mean, not to expand too far away from the image too soon, but like part of finding this archive of my mum's was actually the joy of the quality of the work, like this unintentional. I mean, she was interested in photography. She would have always said on a kind of, just like skirting it kind of level, never really went deep, but owns like nice Nikon cameras and definitely worked in the dark room to a certain degree. And, you know, uh, yeah, it's something about the tangibility and the beauty of the analog images, even made in a, I mean, this image to me doesn't look throwaway, but viewed from one point of view, like photographing oneself in the mirror is kind of like, it's almost like it's a trope, it's one of the go-tos as you're kind of working out this machine and you're dealing with like looking at yourself sometimes because you're too shy to point it at other people, sometimes because you've already pointed at other people and you want to see kind of what yourself looks like. And obviously introducing one's own naked body is an extension of that. But yeah, on a broader kind of level, it was like, I think the image by its analog quality, the palette, the way that analog processes just interact with the world, even in what is often a throwaway way, have such aesthetic kind of, they hold so firmly or something all the way into our current kind of like image mania world. Yeah, and like, I don't know, I feel like I'm jumping away in a tangent a little bit, but certainly part of my excitement of finding that archive from whence this particular image, this was after Mum died, I found this box of images of her life by other people, of her, some quite sexualized, it was a window into this person who I didn't know, who I'd never known. I always knew, I knew my mum as my mum, and our life together occupied a certain period of her life. And of course, there's this whole adventure that you're not privy to as a child, and you get kind of like the piecemeal bits of narrative, and you're aware of the like maybe 10 or 15 images that live in your home that kind of like serve as identifiers for the various points of that person's life, like the childhood image, confirmation or whatever, teenage, this image with that pet or whatever. It tends to be quite limited. So you have this kind of like, small little slices of someone's kind of life before you knew them. And then I found this box that was like all the unedited stuff. It was like all this other shit, like all these, the sexual person, the sexual being, the kind of like performative person, the artist, the like lover, the partner, the traveler, like all these other things that I knew little bits of. The little girl, but again, actually the little girl is incorrect, because really it was to do with her late teens and 20s, when she was like making photographs and having photographs made of her by various like people she was surrounded with in the kind of art scene and the art school scene. So it was really just this like total opening of the door to this, myriad other personas of this person who I knew as well as anyone could know someone, but obviously we only ever know people to a certain degree or whatever, and who I just spent 2 years with in this extremely like intense, close situation where she was dying, and that was devastating me and it was devastating her. And then after she died, I had this like portal is such a kind of naff word, but like this access point to all these other aspects of her life. And because I was writing my master's thesis at the time, and I was writing about the difference in terms of like auratics and like meaning and memory to do with the digital dematerialized image and the analog image, and focusing on the images I had made of her as she died, and then including, as the process went on, the images that I found in this archive, I was thinking about, histories, and I continue to do so as regards like how much rarer situations like that are going to become, and like the idea of histories on all levels, on like the personal, the superstructural, the like historical, ostensibly viewed from one point of view, relying on some kind of like records, like some kind of evidentiary force, as Barthes puts it, that the photographic image has, that like this was there, this person stood in front of this other person with this camera, like this very kind of raw, bordering on the empirical. You can stand with a photograph that has been printed in a dark room, and it's as close to an empirical piece of data that one can have, and how like that's just drifting away. Hard drives will die, CDs will die, computers will die, phones will die, like the image record of both like the family, the personal, and then I guess like on a broader level, like, you know, state histories, like I don't know how they're going to survive in the way that we have known them to do. And I mean that, yeah, that I mean it throws all sorts of things in potential kind of crisis. And it makes me sad on a personal level that like less and less people will find stuff like I was lucky enough to do and have this kind of like experience and this opportunity, and to have the actual objects. Like the objects are treasured objects, they're precious, and they fucking survive, you know. They're kind of amazing things. Like a photograph will be made in 1972 and it'll just sit in a box for like 40 years and you'll pull it out and it's like perfect, you know, in a way that the hard drive won't. Not yet, anyway. I don't probably think ever. Like, I don't know if that technology will ever have the kind of like temporal longevity, or like backwards compatibility. I think that like we're looking at this extremely like chopped kind of short histories. Like the stuff I'm reading at the moment is kind of talking about like the event and like imminence, and it feels to me like we're living ever more. I mean, it's almost a cliche to say around the news cycle and so on, but on every kind of level, even when you think of it in a kind of wider, from a wider angle, like things just kind of are like, it's just happening and then gonna go, you know. I don't know what the record even means now in terms of the hyper normal virtual information fucking velocity sphere, whatever the hell we live in at the moment. Like, you know, what formulates some form of like coherent story. I mean, it's like the postmodern thing of the death of the meta narrative has just like 100% happens like 20 years later. Like, you know, we thought it was happening in the 70s and it was like this kind of crisis or whatever, but a positive one, the positive, you know, in terms of the canon and disrupting all these kind of like patriarchal, superstructural, blah, blah. But now it's kind of like really happened. Like there is no narrative. There's just like slop and mulch and events, and I don't know. Yeah, I try not to be too nihilistic within it all, but I definitely think it's like a fucking fascinating, vertigo-inducing moment.
There's so much to react there. There's loads of stuff. Like, I'm going to pick out a few things. So, even going back to what you said about, I know my mum as my mum. So these images actually allowed you to access this person that you didn't know, like this private person that wasn't your mother, but it was another person. And it was interesting. I find that in reverse as well with kids, that as a parent, I think I know my kids, even young kids. But I don't. They have desires, they have other things going on that they'll never share with me. And it's this kind of, this privacy, this kind of, you mentioned sexuality. Like this is something that doesn't, you know, cross over between parent and child. It's always kind of hidden, but it's there. It's there. It's there behind all the kind of role playing in a certain way. And like, even just to pick up on that, because this image of your mother looking in this mirror, like, I find it like, it seems so confident the way she's sitting or standing and looking through this.
Yeah, it's quite confrontational, or in a like.
Yes. And it's unusual to see that, like, a woman looking in the mirror at themselves, they're going to, unlike a man who's full of flaws, even physical flaws, won't pick up on the flaws of their body as much as a woman. It's one, I don't want to generalize that, but
it is true. I mean, we are afforded a much looser gamut of physical perfection or whatever.
But I think it's something about a pregnant woman looking in the mirror. It's different because I know when I looked at my wife's images of her looking in the mirror at this bump, she wasn't looking at herself. She was looking at the bump. It was kind of in between those that so that was helping out with the kind of posture. It was kind of, oh, this is my bump. It's not everything else. It's not the other bumps. It's this bump. And there's something about there's a pride in it in this pose. There's a kind of I'm going to capture this now, and I'm going to capture this moment. And also what you spoke about imagery, we take all these photographs and it's all mulch and it's everywhere. There's something precious about it. Like this is an image that is your mother's image, but it's also you're using it again as your image in a certain way. So it's kind of got a double bind in it that your closeness to it, there's a preciousness about this image that it holds a lot. And it even holds a lot for someone. When I first saw it in the kind of uploaded file, I was kind of like, wow, like it is striking, even without the baggage, even without the personal baggage.
I'm curious, did you read it as a pregnancy display image?
At first not, because it seems that is it 3 months in, or is it a little bit more formal?
It would have to be very early. Like I said, when I found the image in the thing, that's immediately what my brain, I was like, she's photographing her like little bump, but it was only wet. And that's like, it entered into the lore of like, that was the stand-in for that in my mind. It was never elucidated in the work in any way. It was just for myself. Like, that's what that was. That was where the image of the duet kind of coalesced like this. That was her picture of the two of us kind of thing. But then, of course, way later, I kind of looked at it and I was like, what age is she? I don't know if that, I realized I had none of the evidentiary kind of reality to like actually lynch that code onto the image. But then I was like, well, it's too late now. That's what it does. So that's what it does. But yeah, I'm not sure. It would be very early, but I don't even know where she is. But that's what I love about all that whole aspect to it, I don't know what flat she's in. I don't know what country she's in. It looks kind of like, somehow glamorous or Mediterranean or something, possibly like,
Morocco.
Morocco, yeah. It might be Gozo. She spent a bit of time, like I was conceived in a cave in Tenerife, so maybe it was like the Canary Isle. I mean, I don't know, it's all the surrounding, like, bits of lore that one has to grasp onto. Sorry, go on.
So like I know of, I saw a book of yours. It was kind of a prototype book, before, and it's one that I think should be made into a publication in a sense. It should be in the world. And it kind of surrounds what we're talking about here. In terms of death, about family, about all those things that are so kind of central to all our lives. So can you explain that a little bit about that book in relation to this photograph?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fun. Very kind of you to say that. We were just talking earlier, I don't know if I was recording, about does everything need to be made into a book? And that was one. It was funny when we looked at it together, and you were so positive. It really gave me pause, because I had decided at some point, I was like, I just can't make this work. And maybe it's just telling me that this does not need to live in a book. I think I got 5 of them made, and I was like, maybe that's just all it is. Maybe it doesn't need to be this like ever propagating thing, this work in the world. But it also, yeah, I don't know, it might definitely, I also think I needed a break from looking at this work at that point. I'd kind of spent a long time living in it, and somehow the book was like just the last Rubicon where I couldn't get it to work fully in a way, or at the time my relationship to it couldn't work. But looking at it again with you, and the Sheila that time was kind of like, God, maybe it's not as, it's functioning better than I thought it was on a kind of formal level or something. But yeah, the book was ostensibly, sorry, I'm doing this totally backwards. The book representation of Dree in the End, which is the body of work that the image that we're talking about was drawn from. And that was, that was like this large form duet between my work and the work of my mum. My work more or less around images made, very few images that I made around the couple of years where she was terminally ill. And then after she died, I found this big archive. And then I had to write a master's thesis, so I wrote it about the only thing I could kind of think about at the time, which was her death. And I used various images, and I used Roland Barthes's recently released at the time Morning Diary, which was like the aphoristic framework that would go on to become Camera Lucida, which is obviously the kind of seminal treatise on photographs and memory, which he talks about these images of his mother, and he's seeking the image that fully, like, the contains her presence on some kind of affective level for him that, pierces him or whatever. So I wrote this thesis, and then following the thesis, it kind of started developing into some kind of like something that I felt could actually be a body of work. It was never really my intention. The first thing was just making pictures. The second thing was just I had to write a thesis, or otherwise it was going to cost me $5,000 to do my master's for like the 4th year or whatever, to kick it down the road. So I kind of had to write this thesis, and then the thesis became the framework for like this body of work, which then was shown a couple of times and really kind of, I think, worked. It was the first thing I've ever made as a picture maker, as an artist, that like kind of like worked. It had, it did what I was hoping it would do. I think it was complex in its like resonances or something. I was really interested. Like Mum was a Jungian, and I was using a lot of Freud and Jung in the kind of theoretical breakdown of the thesis stuff. And like a lot of it was, I was interested in like my, cathexis and my desire. And that was born of looking at these pictures of my mum as like, a young sexualized body being, in herself, and really like inhabiting that part of herself. And this was something me and Mum had talked about. I mean, given her therapeutic background and stuff, I'd written a text earlier on in my master's while she was sick, and I was already talking about these kind of things, like the seeking, like the what formulates our structures of desire, and the closeness of me and Mum. I mean, it's all basically like Oedipus, like, but just not too fine points on it. But like both in that text I wrote when she was still alive, that she accidentally read, and kind of we sat down and talked about these aspects of our dynamic and our relationship. I suppose for her it was to do with the fact that at a certain point in our life she had kind of decided that, my father had left when I was 2. She had decided that I would be the only kind of man in her life as far as I would know. And she sat me down and she read this text and was like, I did actually have affairs. I just always kept them very kind of like secret from you, because I felt it was important for your kind of formulation to just like it to be very simple, like our dynamic, which of course was highly beneficial, but also totally kind of like pathologizing in its own way, which I think there's no escaping as a parent. No matter what you do, you're going to give your kids some kind of fucking fucked up pathologies. But the work during the end was definitely about grief, or I was hoping, I hope it was about grief and loss and kind of love and closeness and relationship, but also about my relationships to my partners throughout my life, and the echoes of that in those dynamics, both even in brute terms. I mean, the first thing was when I found all these pictures of a 20-something mum, 17, 20, 25, 29, I could just see all my various partners through that period of my own life echoed in them, in terms of how she looked and how she walked and all these things. You start to realize that you're like working off a blueprint, you're the family, how is it the Paglia puts it, the family drama or the family romance, informs that's the first romance you have, and it just informs every every subsequent one, you know, you're always operating in the shadow of it. So as much as it was about death and life, it was hopefully about kind of sex and sexuality and drives and desire, and how a great death in one's life kind of throws all those things into like, yeah, like crisis relief, opens them up, and yeah, offers like releases and frees you from things as much as it, you know, traumatizes you or whatever it might. Yeah, the book was something that I went so far with and got five, and then kind of was like, I'm not sure if it's working, and let's shelve it for now. But yeah, perhaps we'll have a life.
Yeah, like in a way, something so precious, like because it is a kind of precious document of a life, and it's kind of very like even sharing it to the world. There's questions about it, isn't there? Like I think you brought up before, even in our email exchange before this, about ethics and the ethics of photography and all this kind of stuff. Um, but like what I got from the book as someone who I suppose has experienced kind of, you know, death of family members at an early age and not seeing that evidence, you know, that evidence you're talking about, photography, you know, like I'd love to have a photograph of my mother doing this, you know, in the mirror. And there's something precious about that. There's something about her looking at herself, but looking at the person in the body. Like there's love in it. There's something, and then also you as a photographer, she's holding a camera. Like this is the biggest tribute, isn't it? In a certain way, that you've become a photographer, um, and it's just something really lovely and romantic about that, isn't there? It's like you're kind of carrying on the legacy of image making in a certain way.
Absolutely, and to honor the intimacy, you know, and yeah, I mean the ethical side is so fascinating and so tricky, and I ran into resistance at different points of making this work. You know, some of the images I made of mum were when she was like really sick, and some of them are very beautiful, and some of them are hard going. And then there's the kind of like images she made that I sensibly, you know, I'm taking a bit of a liberty to assume ownership of, and to assume like, you know, she never showed that box of photographs to me, so why should I get to show them to the rest of the world? Um, which is, you know, it's a tricky question. And I suppose I felt at different points that I was willing to take the risk. And, and yeah, and kind of hope, I mean, as you just stated, like one of the few things that bind all of us, or what, the two things that bind us all, is that like we've all been given birth to, and we're all going to lose someone, you know, and it's the two things. And it was like, it felt like to make something that was kind of speaking to that and of that, was worth the kind of ethical risk, you know, and that mum would approve of that or be on board with it. If you were to do it with as much kind of, as much as integrity and truth as you could kind of possibly, you know, plow into it from your side as best you could, and kind of, you know, my partner at the time, who was a theater maker, she was kind of helping me navigate all this stuff, and she just her thing was just like, what was the phrase she used? Oh God, I can't remember now. Radical truth. Yeah, she was just like, just like do it with radical truth, just at best you can, and the chances of it landing, in a way that doesn't feel distasteful to people are higher. You know, you obviously can never be completely, nothing is 100%. You're never gonna like nail it for everybody, but if you approach it in that way, you have a higher chance of it, kind of. And in the main, it was okay. I didn't get nearly as much pushback as I thought I might, you know, given the kind of nature like I was saying, you're kind of talking about someone's death, but you're also talking about their sexuality and your own. And I'm also like a white man, you know, and I'm assuming all these things, and I'm pulling in pictures that are of women that they, you know, there's loads of aspects that would rightly be right for hardcore criticism, but you know, as I said, it was kind of okay in the end, you know, and continues to be.
There's something about like photography, like just going into like I remember as a kid seeing my own mother pass away, and I have real contorted imagery in my head that it's kind of because it was witnessed and then imagined in my head. I didn't have a photograph to rely on, so there's something about photography that both creates an intimacy and a distance and it kind of romanticizes a lot of the time because we pick up on the light, the color, like as I did with this photograph. I'm thinking about Morocco, I'm thinking about Delacroix and stuff like that, but behind that there's all this other stuff. There's all this, it's loaded with all this experience of this person who's your mother. And I have, like, I would love to have photographs, even of my mother passing away, because I think they would be less contorted in my head because they would frame them.
100%. Well, it becomes, I mean, is that Sontag who talks about they become a stand-in for memory? It becomes like the memory, you know, it's just this image. And it's so interesting because like the course of that thesis I mentioned earlier, like basically the what it hinged on was like where is the direct line to the event? Like, and I was trying to analyze like black and white photographs I had made that I had then printed, like hand printed, and analyzing like digital videos that I made with like a little handy cam, and then analyzing like phone photos. That was like the basic premise. It was like in the analog or the digital, where is the kind of like what has the most direct, and the like a funny thing happened where completely when I was making the work afterwards, after the thesis, I realized that like as I was producing all these images, kind of like just to look at them and have them for analysis or whatever, the two really hard ones, like you're saying, of like the person really in like the last bit of their life where it's quite, you know, dark, and you know, they're not really the person you knew anymore, even on a kind of visual level, you know. I'd done all this stuff with, they were like photocopies of photocopies of photocopies. Like I'd entered all kind of totally, I was just thought I was doing some aesthetic experimentation because I had to have all these different kinds of images to analyze. But I realized afterwards, like the ones I had done the most second, third order kind of like processes to were the really hard ones to look at. And I completely degraded them to the point where they were quite graphic, you know, and they still show something that's quite hard. But if I hadn't titled them like Sherrie dying, you would just think it's someone, you know, looking uncomfortable in a bed kind of thing, you know. And which is just an interesting kind of parapraxis or whatever, that obviously just the raw image printed, I just wouldn't have been able to work with it. And as a result, those two pictures, that diptych has become, as you described, my kind of quite softened version of, or that's become the stand-in for my memory of that really difficult week, like the last week at the hospice kind of thing. And the second aspect that I found really interesting, when I finally had to actually come up with a conclusion for the purposes of the thesis, was that actually the image that had the most direct, like, emotional line to the real world was the pictures taken on my phone, because they're so devoid of like the erratic, like whatever formal, like you say, the light, the shadow, you know, you're not in a dark room like burning bits out, dodging, making it, you know, you're not doing an aesthetic formulation. It's just kind of like bang, it's a thing, it's portrait. We look at our phones all day long, and the images I used one in the show, and it was just mum sitting on a bed, and she's like, you know, she's on steroids at the time. She had brain cancer, so her, like, she, you know, she was completely diminished, and like, it's impossible almost for me to look at. It's so painful, you know. And I have images from that same period of time shot on a tripod with like a medium format camera, and they hold none of the same piercing directness, you know. The aesthetics just kind of override the reality of the thing, you know. Which I just thought was a kind of interesting. Now I can only speak for myself, but this idea that, you know, on one hand, we have this like absolute proliferation of images that ostensibly live as data that are in the main rather unaestheticized and vernacular and direct, but actually hold this extremely direct power that like a very artfully produced black and white or color image printed kind of doesn't have. But then this new archive that has this power has no longevity. Like, it's just going to diminish and disappear. So, you know, you might have these really kind of quite direct and beautiful pictures of the people who you will eventually lose, but you're also going to lose the picture. I don't know. It's a strange kind of paradox, right? Yeah. And this potentially very emotionally weighty archive is just going to fly away, you know?
As a photographer, though, do you want to make like when you looked at this image of your mother, like, and you in some ways appropriated it, and it becomes part of your archive in a certain way. And I think it's a really beautiful photograph. I think, like, aesthetically, emotionally, all those things. And it has that, as I said before, it has that thing where a photographer is holding a camera. You know, I love that image of a photographer holding a camera, because it's really meta in a kind of weird way, because usually the photographer is outside the frame. You know, it's kind of weird. Like, when I've seen Brian Teeling do this a few times in mirrors, and I'm always struck by it, because you're looking at this lens, this eye, and it's blocking the face of the photographer. And it's just something really compelling about it, because it, like, weirdly, the photographer is always absent, you know, unlike the painter, who's there in the brushstrokes and all that kind of stuff and the choices. Whereas the photographer always seems erased from the image in some ways.
Absolutely. I just, as a sidebar, and it's such a fascinating piece of work. Well, as we brought up Brian Teeling, and he made this piece for the show we just did in London together, and it's, as you say, it's a self-portrait of him in the mirror, and the mirror is fogged, heavily fogged. But there's two, like, he's in the center and he's almost obscured by the fog, but you can still see his kind of shimmery outline very definitively as to what he's doing, but it's obscured. And then to the either side of him is a section of mirror that's unfogged. And he printed this photograph onto a mirror. So when you're looking at it, like, basically the elements of the photograph that had no information are mirrored. The two bits of the mirror in the photograph that would be reflective are reflective. So as you're looking at him photographing himself in the mirror, you are implicated. You can either stand behind him and be invisible, or you can move to his left or his right and you're standing in the mirror. And it's just mind-blowingly rich, you know? And like, firstly, as an aesthetic piece, it's just so beautiful. It's this big, beautiful mirror, but with this elusive kind of image that you then realize is a man standing in a bathroom after having taken the shower and photographing himself. But then you step into the frame, and it's just like such an insanely simple conceit that has so many, yeah, as you say, meta levels of cleverness, and just like, yeah, just really the joy of the image is just like, fuck, this is just killer, like, just really killer.
Was it like even going back to that question about the joy of an image? Like when you take photographs, are you looking for something like is it bridging like how it looks aesthetically, color, light, all that stuff, then with the meaning? This is going to be a thing that I'm going to draw out over and over again.
Form v content, right?
Because I've seen some, like, what attracts me to your photographs is a lot of the color and the composite, all those things, composition, form, all that stuff. Even this curated image now of your mother in the photograph, there's photographers generally, I think really good photographers are able to curate their work really well. So they take hundreds of thousands of photographs, but somehow they distill from that collection of works, say, oh, that's it. That's the thing. So what is it? What are you looking for when you're curating images, like this image of your mother or your own images? What is it? What is it?
Like, it's funny. I work very closely with Brian and we're in close dialogue a lot. And another person who's like that is my friend Samuel Kanan, who's like an incredible photographer. And I know because I've spent so much time with him and we're both making pictures that like what he's looking for, I don't want to speak for him, but as far as I'm aware, like it doesn't really matter what the object is for him. He's so tuned into like light and form and the analog processes, like of which he's an extremely sophisticated proponent, that like the object is kind of almost secondary. It's really to do with the formal mechanisms of what it's going to look like photographed, as Gary Winogrand used to say. Like, I want to see what it looks like photographed, what that thing looks like. For me, I'm a little bit more of actually when I'm out in the world, it's so lovely to hear you say that about my composition and color. Like when I'm out in the world, it's actually funny. It's kind of like I tend to be like looking for content. I'm kind of looking for a thing that fits something that I'm kind of half-assedly like thinking about. We spoke before and I mentioned the word acquiescence, and that tends to be how I find the subjects. It's kind of like whatever's happening in my life or what I'm just kind of blundering into. Like the work around my mum was kind of the first time that happened. Something happened to me, and I'd been photographing for years with this kind of like, art school thing of like, I need to formulate an idea of something that I think about the world, and then I go and I like find it in the world to like reaffirm my thesis or something, or certainly this was how I kind of internalize what like a working practice was meant to me. You kind of like, you go, oh, such and such is happening, I think, in the world, or I'm going to go and find this thing. And then you go and you try and kind of like shoehorn the images that you made to like, I don't know, this was my logic anyway. And the work around my mum was something that was just like brutally kind of happening to me. And I've been photographing kind of unsuccessfully for so long, as regards I felt like nothing that I had really made formed what I would call a work. There were like small little sequences of images, suites of images or whatever, but suddenly something was happening to me, and like I had the like rudimentary technical skills to be able to like kind of react to it, like to make pictures of it. And I've tried to, for good or ill, carry that forward, that I kind of just, whenever's kind of my life is going on, and wherever I happen to be, and the life's taken some unusual twists and turns in the last few years, which have all kind of borne like fruit, both, on a personal, have all been kind of adventures, but it predicates to a certain degree in maintaining that kind of way of just operating, which has coincided with me realizing that like, I don't know fucking anything. Like, I don't understand anything enough about the world to go out there and try and impose some kind of will on it. Like, the older I get and the more I read and the more I learn and the more I photograph and the more I make pictures, the more I realize that I don't know, I just like, yeah, I haven't a fucking clue what's going on, and I have no way of comprehending it. Um, so it's really become a thing of kind of reacting, just kind of reacting to things. And then when something maybe hits, like the recent work about the protests here in Berlin, um, was kind of just that. I was like going to the protests because that's where I wanted to be, and I thought it was an important thing to do, obviously. And then because you're there for hours, I kind of started photographing them, but then I'm a bit of a scaredy cat. I'm quite shy, so I'm not going to be like up close. I was interested in the police and in the militarization of the police and the uniforms and all the kind of like semiotics. And this was kind of almost at the point before they got quite violent here. I was just interested. So then I switched to like a long lens, a 500 millimeter lens. So you're like photographing something that's very, very far away, and you have all these technical considerations that limit basically very, very narrowly what kind of photograph you can take. Basically, the subject can't be moving, you can't be moving, you need a lot of light. So you're in this very kinetic situation, but you need stuff that's like stock still. But also they have to be like 500 yards down the road from you for you to be able to photograph them. So it was working with all these weird technical kind of restrictions. And there was just one image then that kind of came of that, or one or two, and I was like, oh shit, okay, this kind of makes sense. Or it felt like it had something in it as regards maybe, I don't know, don't want to like, be too kind of, like subverting maybe, or certainly like operating some kind of like parallel to the way you usually see these situations represented. So that just became the kind of jump off point to like, oh, there's kind of something maybe working here, and then that became, but like it would definitely always be the content of the images. And then it kind of feels like luck when you get one where the light, for me anyway, my brain can't keep all those things on the go at once. I just kind of see something that I find whatever is potentially kind of interesting, and then once like that, something like that happens where you have a couple of pictures that maybe work, then I kind of just go back and like look for kind of more of that, within reason. And then when you kind of run out of road with that, you kind of shift the prism a little bit and see what else, and it just develops from there. But definitely in the battle of form v content, I'm definitely kind of like, my brain is kind of wired to just look at the boring content. Like, for instance, the car pictures of mine that we've talked about, I hope I'm not demystifying myself too much there, but stuff like that, like, I'm just fascinated by cars, and I'm fascinated by Ballard, and I'm fascinated by like the man-machine matrix, and so I'm always photographing cars. Most of them are just pictures of bloody cars, like they're just so boring. And then every now and again you just get one where like that, where it just like transcends, and I mean that's, or potentially transcends, just by the look of the light and the look of the palette, and the beauty of the analog processes that kind of just imbue, a very banal scene with some kind of like graphic sensuousness or charge or something.
It's interesting you use the word charge, because like in a way, like the work, it's interesting talking about your work outside of this photograph and this project and the book about, memories of your mother as someone who's in their 20s and then passing away in illness. And then this other work, this ancillary work that you're doing with cars and protests and that kind of stuff. And I always wonder, I had this when my mother passed away, that I had a lot of this stuff to express, and I expressed it through painting. My medium was painting, and I did these very explicit images, not sexually explicit, but explicit about the trauma of my mother passing. And I had to express them in that form to get through them. And like when I look at this image of your mother and the archive and the book and all that kind of stuff, it feels like, a kind of process that you worked through, and you made this something very rich out of that process of trauma, you know. And I'm kind of wondering what happens to an artist, because for me, when I had up till I was painting these like ridiculously Madonna and Child over and over again. But weirdly, I didn't realize why I had become obsessed with the Madonna and Child.
Like whatever you want to say about Freud as like as a a therapeutic dogma, say, or a schema, like I mean the perceptions that I find, like, they're just the leaps of like intellect that that guy was making, and Vienna, like, in the milieu from which it emerged. um I mean, that's just so extraordinary, so extraordinary
Yeah.
that I think working out the repetitive, the repetition until, like, at what point did you decide, consciously or otherwise, that this was now done?
It's kind of, you get to a point of exhaustion, maybe, and it starts to untangle, and maybe you start to become aware of what you're doing. Yeah, so the energy behind it is an unawareness in a certain way, that you're making this stuff, but you don't know why. And that's really, there's an act kind of very freeing to do that. But it's very direct. It's you know why you don't know why you're doing it, but you're doing it. And then you exhaust that process, but then you still are trying to reach back. And I suppose that's my question to you, is kind of trauma for artists, wherever it's coming from, it does creep into the work. Like, you could be a very objective artist, and then something happens to you personally, and your work changes dramatically, and it may go on for months or years or whatever it is. But you have to unpack that in a certain way in your work, and it will bleed into it in some form. Sometimes explicitly, but sometimes kind of subliminally or libidinally underneath it.
I even think the idea of being an objective artist, if someone told me that, like, oh, my work is very objective, and I just tried to, I'd be like, what the fuck are you running from? Like, what are you hiding? Like, I'd be more worried about that person than the person who's like taking the naked selfies. Like, you know what I mean? Uh, like, they're the ones to watch, the ones who think that they've kind of like transcended their own personal bullshit. And I also think, I mean, I don't know, I saw something the other day, this is another fucking tangent, but like, about the pile of dirt, the Biennale pile of dirt, and how that even kind of curators at the Biennale level are just kind of like, we need to move past this. Like, something has shifted in the world where this kind of highly academic, self-referential art world art is just like, I would personally agree with whoever this person was. It's just over. Like, like AI, the internet, the political situation, the omni crisis, like, it just has to be like as fucking Freudian as possible, and like completely demented and completely full of your pathologies and your humanness and your irrationality, and like, just fully engaged, like this kind of like, yeah, white cube with some like incredibly kind of, elusive object. I can't. I'm just like, can't cope with that. Like, what's it for? What's it fucking talking about? I don't care anymore. I've seen enough, but it had its moment. And now it's just, we got to get like full data. Like, the world is fucking really in a strange place, and like the fucking techno ontology that we're all trying to kind of navigate, the only answer is to like really, like, what is human, and like what is that, where is that inside us? Like, there is no fucking objectivity anymore. Leave that to the LLRs, or LLMs, or whatever they're fucking called. uh,
Yeah, so yeah, like maybe even think about that, like that's amazing work, and like you really, really, and this image there, this is a curated image, and we bringing this to fore, because I don't know if another thought of this as a photograph, or as formally as a good photograph, or was it just a document
Yeah, I
of a
mean,
time?
it's so hard to know. Yeah, it's so hard to know. I mean, my mum, because I obviously got into photography partially because of the cameras that she owned and her brothers owned, and I kind of adopted or stole or inherited or whatever. She would always be like, "Oh, you know, you're so good," because I just thought everything I did was great, even when it wasn't. And she would always maintain that she couldn't take a photograph. I can't, you know, like, you know, classic. I cut everyone's heads off. There's always a lamppost sticking out of someone's head and all this. And then, of course, I found this box of these very beautifully aesthetically considered images, both of her by other people, by her of other people, by her of herself. And, like, you know, they were just all, you know, they were, but it was it was again, like I said earlier, it was like a window into, like, you know, my mum was an extraordinarily aesthetic person. You know, like her notice boards, her airing cupboard, like everything about her house, like her, you know, she just had this extraordinary. Her and her brothers all have this kind of amazing, everything they do is a set of size. You know, they eat a packet of crisps and they'll fold it up into this tiny little perfectly square, smooth little folded thing and put it down as they're talking to you. They would not even know they're doing it. You know, they have this extraordinary um, kind of way of approaching it. I think it must be something to do with a reaction to the chaos of their upbringing, which was like extremely dysfunctional and traumatic. And they have some, they're like, you know, we moved a lot. My uncle, who I know best, also moved a lot, and we all have this reward. I've inherited a small but capacity to like move into a flat, and within like a week, it's completely like, you know, looks like it's been lived in for 25 years, and everything is just completely jammed full of stuff, but everything has its kind of place in this kind of very aestheticized, precise but like relaxed, loose way. They're fascinating people. But the photo thing was just always so interesting to me, this maintenance of, like, you know, um, yeah, maintenance of having no kind of skill for it, and then finding this archives that was completely contrary to that, you know, and of course far more in tune with the person who I knew and the way they actually lived, you know. Um, it's just she put that energy not into visual art, into just everything else in life, which is, you know, talk about an artist's life and all those kind of 70s French projects of melding of the two. And yeah, you know, it's definitely just something in there.
That's lovely. Yes, you know, I'm like it's a tribute in a certain way, and like a real tribute because as someone who's experiencing this is, you know, death and the million deaths and stuff like that. It's kind of a lovely tribute to the death. And especially that something that I really want to see as anything world. Especially with this kind of not visual, with this like this thing. What I was going to say, I suppose, to like maybe end up here and just maybe mention some artists that you're, or authors or people like that outside of you that you're interested. Not only doing your order, but other is this kind of inspire you to make work, whether they're photographers or writers or whatever it is.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, at the moment, at the moment, there's two people who I mean, three, I suppose, that I'm kind of, yeah, like I always have a number of like total obsessions on the go, and thankfully as I've gotten older, it's kind of narrowed into a rotating but reduced cast, which gives my fucking brain a little bit of a break, and I'm always kind of casting out. Also, endlessly buy new back catalogs of people's work when I get completely obsessed with it. At the moment, I'm kind of moving past the protest work, I think, into, I want to make something around the idea of, I think I mentioned to you in the email, about housing and like homelessness and unhoused, and like part of it is a continuing through line of my own pathologies. Like I always had this to do with the tightness of me and my mum's relationship. Like from when I was a very, very little boy, like I always had this kind of like completely indentured, no, like very firmly, very, I find words, a very solid kind of belief that when my mum died, that I would end up homeless, that I wouldn't be able to kind of cope or wouldn't be able to look after myself in the basic level. And that was from when I was a very little boy. And obviously it was like part of that irrational childhood thing of like, your parent is your world and they provide all the kind of security and stuff. But it kind of lingered for me for some, I kind of became aware later in life that this was like a overhang from like a childhood thing. And as my partner Jules pointed out to me the other day, we also moved house like nearly every 4 or 5 years all the way through my life, and always at the kind of, it was always an external decision. It was a landlord or something happened. So we were always kind of like, always, you know, we moved a number of times, and it was always stressful. So it obviously, the two things gave me this kind of like, you know, thing around like home and security and so on and so forth. And then also like the extremely intense relationship between me and my mum also left me with this idea that with her not alive, there's just no way I'd be able to kind of like do the grown-up life things or whatever. And that thankfully has proved not to be the case, but it's still something I kind of grapple with. And I still live in, I mean, you know, I'm an artist, like, and the world is the world at the moment. Like my life is still extremely precarious. And there has been points since she died where I basically had nowhere to live. And it's partially why I ended up in Berlin. I had nowhere to live. I had a dog in Ireland. It would have meant like giving up the dog that was essentially my family in order to like get somewhere to live that I couldn't really afford anyway. So as it stood, I moved to Berlin, which was the best possible thing I could have done. It really worked out. But even here, you know, you don't know. Like it's a like it's a perpetual point of conversation that this person who's been in their flat for 30 years suddenly has to leave. It's like, where are they going to go? And there's no flats and they're all like really expensive, all that stuff. So on a personal level, it's something that swims around my pathology. And then on a kind of like broader level, I'm interested in the ethical frameworks around the photographic image. And this is a point of conjecture on my end, and I could 100% be proved wrong as I kind of delve into it. But I'm interested in the processes that certain things have become taboo to represent, you know, and that's to do with power dynamics and image making, and they're all legitimate. But the net result, of course, is that even as certain social problems become increasingly prevalent, I mean, I think housing is pretty much a global crisis in the West, at least, you know, housing precarity and housing availability and affordability and all those things. And then the actual problem of the people who are unhoused, like outside people who don't have a home, has become less and less of something that's represented as far as I can kind of tell, you know. I think part of that is aesthetically, it was a trope of photography that then became passé, and I understand that. But I'm interested in maybe either even speculatively looking at like, do the neoliberal processes that also propagate these problems serve to erase them as subjects that we can kind of visually speak about? And then there's this third level where like people are doing this stuff all the time. Like there's all these citizen journalists that I follow in the States who make these extremely tender, extremely beautiful video kind of journals of like the extreme housing crisis areas in like, you know, East Hastings in Vancouver and downtown Los Angeles, where there's these huge, you know, homeless encampments and these people in like extremely, but like making their lives and like surviving, and like obviously loads of like opioid use, and but like these people are making these videos obviously to make this visible, like to make it visible, and like the ethical concerns, obviously, like it's video work, so the people are consenting to speak, but I find them extremely like affecting and beautiful, and the humanity of these people and their character, like even in these kind of fucking completely insane situations in which they're living, and really comes across. And I suppose just photography is my medium, so selfishly I'm just interested in like at what point did the image of the unhoused become kind of like, oh, we don't do that anymore, and why, and how that's concurrent with the problem getting bigger. It's like the problem gets bigger, but we're not allowed to look at it in my world, in the photographic world. And maybe I'm imagining also, I don't know, but I want to kind of investigate. And in the process of that, I return to two people who I'm kind of like long run obsessed with. One is William T. Ballman, who's a writer and artist. From the States. He lives in Sacramento now, and he's made a bunch of work about like the poor, basically, about people in the margins, whatever you want to call it. Like, but he's gotten a lot of flack at different points because he basically, he's a pretty unusual guy. He's extremely like, he, a bit like Antoine Delgado, like he does this kind of, or he has done different points, like, and a bit like I do a very, very, very like toe in the water version of, like I was saying about earlier, the kind of acting. It seems like the work is just born of his kind of drifting through life, and he gets interested in these things. And like at one point he got really interested in like the history of human violence. So he went and fought with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and he went to even the Balkans during the various like internecine breakup wars there, and two of his friends were shot, and he was photographing his friends after they were shot. And like it seems like he's very much like following his interests, and the work is a byproduct of that. And at different points he's made work about sex workers, but he will go and live, but I don't think it's a like, I'm a journalist, I'm going to go and live with these people and live the way they do. I think he just kind of, he makes friends with them, and then he's like, this is fascinating, and he ends up getting addicted to meth and living for 3 years in this kind of he just fully, and then he produces these extraordinarily like detailed kind of treatises on these things. I think the original Rising Up and Rising Down, the history of violence, is like a 12 book 10 million words like block, which you can't get anymore. There's like an abridged version of it. He's another book called Rainbow Stories, I think, which is about like the Tenderloin in Los Angeles, which or in San Francisco where he was living at the time. And he also, sorry, to get to my point, was that he will often pay the people. He if he wants to talk to them and to tell their story, he'll like hang out with them, live with them, do drugs with them, sleep with them if they're a sex worker, pay them. Like it's totally imbricated kind of way of operating, but the humanity of the people and his humanity are just totally intertwined. And I don't, from listening to, there's not a huge amount, he's quite a reclusive person, there's not a huge amount of him speaking, but it doesn't feel like to me like this is a kind of like I'm extracting work from these people. He's just wants to tell their stories, and it's like how best to do that. And if that means that if they need money, I give them money. If it means kind of like hanging out with them, or they come and live with me, on my place in Sacramento, it just seems like a completely human blurring of the boundaries of kind of subject and object and author and person, and in a way that, I mean, I think the work is extraordinary. Like his writing is extraordinary, and he I was very kindly gifted by Jules the 2-book compendium of his visual work, which is called Shadows of Love and Shadows of Loneliness, which I think is just an absolutely incredible title. Like, God, you wish you thought of it. Like, and it's all his photographs all the way through, and they're just like, they're very sophisticated at times. He uses large format by gum, and he does all these alternative processes, silver gelatin, blah, blah, blah. But there's a kind of just like truth telling in them. They're just very like, you know, this is the thing. Which again, back to the work about my mum, the different elements of artifice and erratics and how obstructive they can be and how valuable they can also be at different times. And yeah, that's kind of who I'm in terms of trying to think about this work of maybe approaching the unhoused and the idea of housing and precarity. His work is definitely swimming around, or something that I'm kind of looking at in a very definitive way, not to like ape it per se, but just in terms of something about the honesty of approach and the honesty then of output, you know, that if you just kind of, if you go at it in the kind of most direct way, that perhaps you can tell the story in the truest way or the most human way. And you don't really have to think about all these ethical, not that I don't want to think about the ethical concerns, but about formulating some kind of ethics of image making that is not so restrictive or something, that, you know, you can tell the story and you don't have to be kind of always worried about doing it wrong or something. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm still figuring it out. You know, the other person, sorry, is David Van Arowitz, who's an artist who I'm always obsessed with. And again, I'm almost less interested in his, well, no, not again, not like Volman so much, but I'm less interested almost in Van Arowitz's picture making. It's his writing that really always I return to. And he just wrote a lot about his childhood. It was very similar to my mum's, which obviously there's some kind of point of fascination for me because he's written about it so extensively. And he spends a long time as a hustler and a homeless hustler. And he writes a lot about those experiences and about the experiences of the people around him. And there's an amazing book called The Waterfront Journals, where it's all told first person as if it's happening to the writer, but there are all these stories that he collected over the years of kind of hustling and living on the absolute margins of America. And they're brutal and they're fucked up and they're so hardcore and they're like, you know, abuse and like weird sex and just like the darkest corners. But they're so fucking human, you know? They're so human. You just like, you know, David Van Arowitz is like the only person I've never met who I think I kind of like love, you know? I just like, there's something about his extreme humanity that like permeates everyone he talks about and everyone who kind of populates his work. And you sat in the end, there's something in those two guys that I'm trying to kind of pull at in terms of how to think about, because I think the housing thing is like, not that I don't know, it's a funny question. Maybe this is something you've thought about. Like, I don't know what the value of art is anymore, or if it ever had one. Like, I don't know. Like, if by which I mean making work about housing, it's like, what do I think's going to happen? You're going to solve the fucking housing crisis? But it's just, you know, for me to try and understand something better, even if it's my own pathology around being afraid of homelessness, it feels like something worth kind of like investigating. I don't know. So, you know,
it's fascinating what you said there, because everything that you've laid out there in terms of the question around artists that you admire kind of lays groundwork for what you have been investigating all along in that, especially the work around, you know, the archiving of your mother's work. Like, there's something in that body of work that you were so close to it that you had broke the line between, you know, objectivity and subjectivity, because you're so in it and involved. And when you mentioned those other photographers, they're breaking that line as well, because whether through kind of sacrificial self-sacrifice in terms of, you know, taking drugs and being among these people and has them, there's something where it kind of just something really enriching in that, but it's rare, because most, like, sometimes when I look at photography, especially the way it's used today, whether in advertising or on Instagram or wherever. It's quite distant.
Yeah.
And there's rare moments in which, and it has the capacity to do this, is to break through that distance, become more intimate.
Yeah.
And maybe this new line of work you're looking at is about kind of encroaching on that intimacy that you did achieve in that work. And it removes the ethics in a certain way because you're involved in it.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of you're inside of it.
Yeah.
It's yours. Like that project with your mother, there's a kind of permission already inside it.
Yes.
You know, is that someone else when you didn't know your mother?
I think you're dead right, and I think possibly part of the process is for me is like, how do I then, approach a subject that, because I am not of it, it is not my identity, how then do I gain permission? And I suppose maybe that's where the formulation of an ethics question comes in. It's like, how do I gain permission to tell a story that is not my own? And does that mean, like Valman, paying the people for their stories? Does that mean, telling one story where you get whatever, how do you do it? Like, how do you not remain on the outside, vulturishly pulling a story that you're then going to use? Like, how do you figure that out? And I suppose, I'm just interested because I know the answers to that were of the world where I was schooled in, where it was like, when I was trained in photography and art photography or whatever, or taught, it was like, war photography had ended with the Vietnam War. What then was the jour was like late photography, like you went in after and you photographed the aftermath. That was what was the kind of thing. And then the massive shifts in like identitarian politics, where telling a story that was not your own from a socioeconomic, ethnic, gender, basically the ends of white guys telling everyone's stories for them, which was definitely a positive thing. But I suppose, I don't know. I'm interested in the fact that the internet world doesn't follow any of those rules. And obviously, it's not the art world, so it doesn't have to. Like, people can just go out and tell their stories. But I think the breaking of those boundaries is perhaps necessary to cut for, I don't know, maybe this is all very loosely formulated stuff. But like, when you see stories being told with great humanity and honesty through a fucking smartphone video, it seems insane that the art world is holding back because of some kind of like ethical architecture that was formulated 30 years ago, and that the world is so fundamentally different now that like it really needs to be reapprehended as to like what can be shown and told and how, and what the actual nuances of that ethical world are, as opposed to this very clear cut, kind of parameters, let's say. Now, I don't know, I could be totally talking gibberish here. I'm not sure, we'll see.
But that's the beautiful question. I think that's what art poses a lot of the time, this kind of confusion. It's not direct like journalistic photography, which is about messaging or about something that is very much connected. The image is very much connected with the content. Always, it has to be direct. Whereas art is kind of nuanced, and that's where the magic is. Like, when I first saw that image of your mother, I was kind of spellbound by it because I didn't really know. I was kind of I was unsure of all the content. I just knew it was doing something through very abstract means, something very emotional and something very it's just, words kind of fail in a certain way to express what it was doing, but it was doing something. And maybe when it becomes too explicit, When art becomes too explicit in its making, it loses that nuance a little bit.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like something someone said to me at the show in London recently. They kind of said they were a friend of mine and they're like a musician, and they just kind of, it was the shows me and Brian's work together, and they said something like, "Oh, you haven't told people like whose work is which or the titles or well, they were just a obviously this is a common strategy in fine art world or whatever that it's just work on a wall. You know what I mean? And I was thinking about as like say you receiving that image from me and as we all navigate the image world, I mean, less so on the machine, but on the phone, I feel like we're constantly fed images devoid of context. Like, you know what I mean? Like on Instagram and stuff, which is kind of a new thing, right? Like say Bart's was talking about like the punctum and blah blah blah. And it was because every image nearly always came with like a caption. It was quite rare for you to like get someone to hand you a photograph and just be like, and you had to kind of formulate, but it's become quite common for us now that we just like, I will very often just on Instagram on the feed and it just be like some wild image, but it's an account I don't know what it is. The name is just some, and I have no context for what, and you kind of maybe can go and look for it, and sometimes you can't find it, and it's just like it's a kind of new aspect of the kind of the virtual sphere or something, that is like it's anchored. Anchor is the word he uses. These unanchored images are just kind of floating around, like completely up for grabs, and which is so maybe a good thing.
I think we'll end there. That's been great, brilliant. Any last words? Because I like to give the artist the last words. So, any?
Oh, God, no, I don't know. I think I've like pretty much said everything I. Oh, actually, no, I will have. There's a quote. I'm reading the new Slavoj Zizek, which I would recommend. Um, and I picked out this quote that just popped into. I thought maybe in case I ran out of things to say. Um, and this is Zizek quoting Nietzsche from 1888. Now, will I be able to find it or not? Of course, is the question. Um, but I thought this was. I've never really been a big Nietzsche reader. Have you? Are you familiar?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, I mean, I'm kind of aware. Oh, for fuck's sake, where's it gone? Oh yeah. Okay. So this is Nietzsche writing in 1888, Ecce Homo. For when truth battles against the lies of millennia, there will be shock waves, earthquakes, and transposition of hills and valleys such as the world has never yet imagined, even in its dreams. The concept of politics then becomes entirely absorbed into the realm of spiritual warfare. All the mighty worlds of the ancient order of society are blown into space, for they are all based on lies. There will be wars the like of which had never been seen on Earth before. Which just I found kind of extraordinary and prescient, given, as Zizek talks about a little bit in this book and elsewhere, the clattering return of religion and spirituality back into our politics, which of course he, talks about basically being the return of the political. But we had this tiny little window there where politics was secularized, and we all kind of thought that that's like the arc of progress ever ascending. And there's a bang, we're just like, religion is back, and that is politics, and religion and politics are one and the same, totally rhizomatic, and forget about it. But what he's talking about truth, about like this idea, just back to what we were saying earlier about the evidentiary force and what that means to like our psychic understanding and history, and then like the record and the narrative and the narratives we all kind of like cling on to, and how, I mean, it certainly feels right now, given all the various situations going on, that like the falling away of that kind of through line of some kind of coherent evidence around, so whatever is true or not, is possibly going to lead us to some strange places.